Welcome to our presentation about Canadian identity by Shang Gao and Thomas Chung. Start of our independence. After World War I ended in 1918, a treaty was signed between Germany, France, Britain, and USA that marked a powerful step towards our independence. Prime Minister Robert Bourne demanded for a separate Dominion. Signing was successful. This also led to a separate seat in the League of Nations. Britain began to see Canada as its own country after the war. Treaties between Britain and Canada were signed to break off ties in economics and government. This new Canada became heavily influenced by American culture during 1900s. From music to clothes, much of our culture comes from the USA. Women in the war were called the backbone of our economy. They worked while all the men were off to war. This led to many women's rights movements and ideas of equality that spread throughout Canada. At the start of World War II, Canadians wanted to stay neutral. However, most Canadians still felt a strong tie with Britain and a sense of loyalty, so they declared war on Germany on September 10, 1939. Mackenzie King wanted to let the public know that this declaration of war was due to a high amount of votes towards war, and that it was all under Canadian terms. After liberating Holland and bringing supplies that was much needed, Canadian soldiers were celebrated as national heroes in Europe. During World War II, Canada's economy turned into a total war economy, where most factories began producing war supplies to ship off to Europe. This created a lot of jobs, but people had nothing to spend their money on. Canada's economy became richer and richer. Multiculturalism also started near the end of World War II, along with human rights.
We wanted to change our identity because everything in Canada was based off of British identity. Now, why is this bad? It's because it will make other countries feel that Canada is weak and not independent enough. One event that sparked the change of our identity was the Suez Crisis, which was a conflict between British and Egyptian forces. Basically, the crisis was a war over an important canal in the Egyptian region. Ultimately, the Egyptians disliked the British, and since Canada was too similar to Britain, they started to dislike Canada too. Many things were to be changed. This included our flag, our language, and our military. They changed their flag to a maple leaf, which is a recognizable character of Canada. This is important because it establishes a country's national symbol. The Cold War was an indirect war between Russia and the US. The Americans were afraid that the Russians would try to spread the idea of communism. There was not a war, but a competition to see which military's weapons were more advanced. This had to involve Canada because the shortest route to reach either country involves crossing Canada from the North Pole. Because of the situation, Canada was forced to side with the US. Even before the end of the Second World War, the Allies were beginning to drift apart. And as the USSR grew increasingly stubborn in dealing with Britain and the United States, it was clear that establishing national associations was not going to be an easy task. Igor Guzenko was a cipher clerk for the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. He defected on September 5th, which forced the Canadian government to call a royal commission to investigate espionage in Canada. Public servants and scientists were examined, which ultimately slowed down the production of nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Thanks to the Soviet Union, the Americans were heavily armed and ready for any type of war action. At this time, American weapons were far more advanced than the Russians. The Russian missiles couldn't even reach the States. So the Russians decided to move to a more appropriate area, which was Cuba. This way the missiles could reach the United States. A deployment in Cuba would double the danger from the Soviet Union. Thanks to President John F. Kennedy, the war was avoided. Negotiations and suppression of weapon development resulted in avoiding what people would call World War III. So how does this affect Canada? During the Cold War, Canada sided with the Americans and received heavy cultural and political influences. They couldn't just opt out in the Cuban Missile Crisis. War tactics were also adapted from the Americans.
Thank you for listening.